Picture this: 875 years after Christ, and the North Sea is absolutely losing its mind. We're talking waves that would make a modern surfer weep with terror, waves taller than 3 longhouses stacked on top of each other, crashing into the Norwegian coast like Thor himself was having the worst day of his immortal life. Now, in the village of Sognefjord, Tata, and try to imagine this place, listeners, because it's going to matter. There's a young man named Bjorn. He's about 20 years old, which in the 9th century means he's already considered a full adult, probably been on a few raids, maybe even killed a man or two. But nothing, and I mean nothing, had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The storm hit Sognefjord like nature's own siege engine. Rain didn't just fall, it attacked. It poured through his family's hall roof with the persistence of an enemy army, drowning their winter grain stores that represented months of careful preparation. These weren't just supplies, people. In a world where winter meant potential starvation, losing your grain stores was like watching your family's future wash away in real time. But here's where it gets personal, and this is important because it explains everything that comes after. Bjorn's infant sister died that night. Not from violence, not from disease, but from the cold that seeped through their failing roof. His father, a warrior who had probably faced down berserkers and rival jarls, never recovered from the chill that settled into his sword arm. Imagine that. A fighting man's career ended not by enemy blade but by water dripping through rotting timber. That night, as Bjorn held his sister's cold body while rain continued to mock their grief, something crystallized in his mind. An obsession was born, not with gold or glory or conquest, but with defeating water itself. And you know what? That obsession would change the entire Norse world. See, this wasn't just Bjorn's problem. This was the problem that plagued every single Norse settlement from the ice fields of Iceland to the trading posts of Kiev. Think about the scale here, listeners. We're talking about an entire civilization constantly at war with the weather, and losing. Traditional roofs, and by traditional, I mean the methods that had been passed down for generations, lasted barely 5 winters before rot claimed the timber. 5 winters. In modern terms, that's like buying a car that falls apart after 5 years, except replacing your roof meant cutting down entire forests and dedicating months of labor that should have been spent on literally anything else. Let me paint you a picture of what this meant in practical terms. Warriors, IMC, men whose entire identity revolved around being ready for battle at a moment's notice, were spending more time fixing roofs than training with their weapons. Women, who already carried the enormous burden of managing household survival, lost countless hours re-smoking meat that had been spoiled by leaks. Children grew sick in the constant damp, their small bodies unable to fight off the illnesses that thrived in wet, cold conditions. Elders suffered through wet winters with bones that ached like someone was driving nails into their joints. Master builder Ulf the Grey, UTE, and we'll be hearing more about him because he becomes crucial to our story. T actually calculated that a typical village spent 30% of its resources just maintaining roofs. 30%. That's wealth that could have funded expeditions to discover new lands, or strengthened defenses against enemies, or simply made life bearable for families trying to survive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. But here's what makes Bjorn different from every other young Norse warrior who lost family to the elements. Instead of accepting this as the way things had always been, he decided to do something about it. This wasn't some nobleman's son with unlimited resources and time to pursue theoretical interests. This was a young man who had just watched his sister die, and he was going to make sure it never happened to anyone else. So Bjorn made a decision that probably seemed crazy to everyone around him. Instead of taking up the sword full-time, instead of pursuing the traditional path of raids and reputation, he apprenticed himself to Ulf the Grey. He was going to learn everything there was to know about traditional roofing methods, OPA, not to accept them, but to understand them well enough to destroy them and build something better. Picture him spending hours watching rain flow off swan feathers and seal pelts, studying the way water moved like it was an enemy he needed to defeat in combat. While other young men his age were drinking mead and boasting about their exploits, Bjorn was obsessing over drainage patterns and water resistance. His first innovations failed spectacularly, and I mean spectacularly. One design he created actually channeled water directly into the Jarl's bed. Imagine being the guy who flooded your lord's sleeping chamber with your revolutionary roofing technique. Bjorn earned himself 20 lashes for that particular failure. But here's the thing, failure taught him more than success ever could have. Then came the night that changed everything. Ulf's workshop burned down from a knocked-over oil lamp. It was a disaster that should have ended Bjorn's dreams before they really began. But as he stood in those ruins, probably thinking his career as an innovator was over before it started, he noticed something remarkable. The overlapping charred boards had actually protected the wood beneath them. Even in destruction, even as fire consumed the workshop, these randomly overlapping pieces had created perfect water channels. It was like the gods themselves were showing him the path forward. But success comes with a price in the Norse world, and Bjorn was about to learn that lesson the hard way, because someone had to. Take the blame for that workshop fire, and apprentices make convenient scapegoats. Bjorn found himself exiled from Sognefjord, cast out from everything he'd ever known, forced to wander east toward the mysterious forests near Uppsala. Now, listeners, this is where our story could have ended. A young man, alone, cast out from his community for pursuing an impossible dream. But sometimes, exile is exactly what innovation needs. Sometimes you have to lose everything to gain the perspective necessary to change everything. Because waiting for Bjorn in those eastern forests were teachers who would help him transform his obsession into something that would revolutionize Norse architecture forever. So there's Bjorn, exiled and wandering east toward the mystical forests near Uppsala. And when I say mystical, I'm not being dramatic here, people. This was a place that even hardened Norse warriors approached with respect, bordering on fear. These weren't just any forests. We're talking about woods so thick, so impossibly dense, that their canopies created natural roofs that never leaked. Think about that for a moment. Nature herself had solved the exact problem that was destroying Norse civilization, and she'd done it right there in those ancient trees. The irony wasn't lost on Bjorn as he walked deeper into shadows that seemed to swallow sound itself. That's where he met the two people who would change everything. Eirik the Wise, a master builder who served the Temple of Uppsala, and Astrid the Vulva, a seeress who knew secret songs that could make wood resist water. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, remember that in the 9th century, the line between practical knowledge and what we'd call magic was pretty much non-existent. Eirik the Wise wasn't just any builder. This was a man who had constructed sacred spaces for the gods themselves, buildings that had to withstand not just weather, but the spiritual forces that flowed through Uppsala. When Bjorn stumbled into his domain, Eirik, probably half-starved and looking like a vagrant, Eirik saw something others had missed. Not just desperation, but the kind of focused obsession that changes the world. But Eirik wasn't about to hand over his secrets to some exile who might disappear at the first sign of hardship. No, he put Bjorn through 3 winters of testing that would have broken lesser men. And I want you to understand what 3 winters meant in 9th century Scandinavia. We're talking about survival challenges that make modern military training look like a weekend camping trip. Eirik made Bjorn cut wood only under specific moon phases. Now, before you roll your eyes, consider this. The moon affects tides, affects when sap rises in trees, affects the moisture content of timber. What looked like mystical nonsense was actually sophisticated understanding of natural cycles that modern science has only recently begun to appreciate. But it was more than just timing. Eirik taught Bjorn to read the soul of each tree through its grain. Picture this young man learning to see stress patterns in wood, the way a warrior reads an opponent's stance. Every ring told a story. Harsh winters that made the wood denser, wet seasons that created weaknesses, lightning strikes that left invisible scars. Then there was Astrid the Vulva. Seeresses held enormous power in Norse society, and Astrid was no exception. She showed Bjorn things that master builders had never thought to observe. How bears chose den sites that stayed dry through spring floods that could drown entire valleys. how certain pines wept resin that hardened into waterproof amber over decades. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood nature's secrets because their lives depended on it. But the real breakthrough, to the moment that would revolutionize Norse architecture forever, came during what Astrid called a vision quest. Now, we might call it meditation, or maybe just exhausted hallucination after days of fasting and exposure. But what Bjorn experienced in that altered state was profound enough to change history. He dreamed of Nithhugga, the dragon that gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree. But instead of seeing destruction, Bjorn saw perfection. The dragon's scales overlapped in patterns so precise that no tooth or claw could penetrate them. Water rolled off that hide like it was flowing down glass. Each scale was positioned at exactly the right angle, overlapping by exactly the right amount. When Bjorn woke from that vision, he understood something that had eluded generations of master builders. The problem wasn't just keeping water out, it was directing water away. Instead of trying to create impermeable barriers that would eventually fail, he needed to create a system that worked with water's natural behavior. Working in secret, because innovation in the 9th century was dangerous business, Bjorn developed what he called his dragon scale technique. Thin oak shingles, each one cut at precise angles that he'd calculated based on his vision and months of observation. They overlapped by exactly 3 finger widths, not 2, not 4, but 3. And here's the genius part. Each shingle was carved with tiny channels that directed water away from the seams. But the wood preparation was just as crucial. Bjorn sealed each shingle with a mixture that sounds almost alchemical: pine resin for waterproofing, beeswax for flexibility, and crushed charcoal for, well, even Bjorn wasn't entirely sure why the charcoal worked, but his experiments proved it made the seal last longer. The first test came during the storm of 878, when Thor himself seemed to be personally testing Bjorn's innovation. Lightning split the sky, wind howled like the voices of the dishonored dead, and rain fell with the fury of an angry god. Every other building in the settlement flooded. Roofs that had been repaired just months before failed catastrophically. But Bjorn's experimental structure? Desert dry inside. Water rolled off those dragon scales like they were enchanted. The tiny channels he'd carved did exactly what he'd envisioned. They turned destructive water into harmless streams that flowed safely away from the building. Word spread across the trade routes faster than wildfire. Merchant Hakon Silvertongue, who had an eye for profit like a hawk has for prey, immediately saw the potential. He offered to fund construction across his entire trading network, promising Bjorn wealth beyond imagination. But success in the Norse world always comes with enemies, and Bjorn's innovation had made him some powerful ones. The Builders Guild, led by a traditionalist named Grim the Stubborn, declared Bjorn's methods not just wrong, but blasphemous, an insult to the old ways that would surely anger the gods themselves. Grim wasn't just concerned about tradition, he was terrified of obsolescence. His entire power structure depended on controlling building knowledge, and here was this young exile threatening to make that knowledge worthless. The guild had political connections, economic leverage, and the weight of tradition behind them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Bjorn's fate, but the future of Norse architecture itself. The confrontation exploded at the Thing of Trondheim in 880. And listeners, when I say exploded, I mean it literally changed the course of Norse civilization. Picture this: hundreds of people gathered from across the known world, jarls, merchants, master craftsmen, warriors, all there to judge whether Bjorn's innovation was genius or heresy. Now, the Thing wasn't just some casual meeting. This was the closest thing the Norse world had to a supreme court, a place where decisions could make or break entire bloodlines. And Grim the Stubborn had spent months preparing for this moment, calling in every favor, leveraging every connection, building a case that Bjorn's methods would anger the gods and bring ruin upon anyone foolish enough to adopt them. But Grim wasn't content to rely on rhetoric alone. The night before the demonstration, he and his apprentices sabotaged Bjorn's test roof. They weakened key supports with careful cuts that would be invisible to casual inspection. They spread pitch on the shingles to ensure that when water hit them, it would create a spectacular, humiliating failure that would end Bjorn's dreams forever. Here's what makes this moment so crucial. Bjorn had anticipated exactly this kind of treachery. Remember, this was a man who had spent years studying his enemies, first water, now human opposition. He knew that Grim wouldn't fight fair, so he prepared accordingly. Instead of building one demonstration roof, Bjorn had secretly constructed 3. Each used slightly different techniques, each was hidden in a different location, and each was guarded by people loyal to his cause. Grim's saboteurs couldn't destroy what they couldn't find, and they certainly couldn't sabotage 3 different roofs simultaneously without revealing their intentions. When the test day arrived, the weather gods seemed to be paying attention. Storm clouds gathered as if on cue, but the rain wasn't going to be enough to truly test these roofs. So the organizers had prepared something more dramatic, 20 men with barrels of water positioned on scaffolds, ready to create an artificial deluge that would simulate the worst possible conditions. The first roof tested was one of Grim's traditional designs, built according to methods that had been used for generations. When the water cascade began, it held for maybe 30 seconds before leaks appeared. Within 2 minutes, the structure was pouring water like a sieve. The crowd murmured, this was exactly what they expected from old methods. Then came Bjorn's sabotaged roof. Grim was probably grinning as the water began to fall, expecting to watch his rival's humiliation. But here's the beautiful irony. Even with weakened supports and pitch-covered shingles, Bjorn's dragon-scale design held perfectly. The water rolled off those carefully angled shingles like they were made of glass. Grim's sabotage had failed completely. But Bjorn wasn't done. He climbed onto the wet roof barefoot, and this is important because it demonstrated something revolutionary. Traditional roofs became death traps when wet. Men slipped and fell regularly during repairs. But Bjorn's carved channels didn't just move water away from the building, they prevented dangerous accumulation on the roof surface itself. He danced across those wet shingles like he was walking on dry ground, demonstrating how his innovation didn't just keep buildings dry, it kept the people maintaining them alive. The crowd went absolutely silent. They were watching the impossible. Jarl Magnus, who was presiding over the thing, declared the innovation approved by acclamation. The evidence was overwhelming, the benefits undeniable. But Grim the Stubborn wasn't finished. Faced with obsolescence, his power crumbling before his eyes, he did what desperate men in the Norse world always did. He challenged Bjorn to holmgang, single combat to the death. Now, understand what this meant. Grim was a master builder, yes, but he was also a veteran warrior who had survived decades of conflict. Bjorn was younger, but he'd spent the last several years focused on construction, not combat training. This should have been a massacre. But here's where location mattered. The duel took place on a rain-soaked island, KPAT, traditional neutral ground for holmgang. But what nobody except Bjorn realized was that his years of studying water movement had given him an almost supernatural understanding of how rain affected terrain. Grim's experience showed immediately as he pressed his attack, forcing Bjorn toward the muddy edges of the fighting ground. His sword work was textbook perfect, his footwork solid, his strategy sound. Any normal opponent would have been dead within minutes. But Bjorn had spent 3 years studying exactly how water moved across surfaces, how it pooled, where it created slick spots that looked safe but weren't. He could see drainage patterns that were invisible to everyone else. While Grim saw a relatively uniform fighting surface, Bjorn saw a complex map of safe footing and hidden traps. Dancing across dry spots that only he could identify, Bjorn maneuvered Grim toward a concealed bog that would look like solid ground until someone stepped on it. When the old master's foot hit that hidden wetland, he stumbled just long enough for Bjorn to get inside his guard. And here's what separates this story from simple revenge fantasy. Bjorn could have killed Grim. He had the perfect opportunity, the legal right, and plenty of motivation, but instead, he chose mercy. He helped his fallen opponent to his feet and declared the matter settled. That single act of mercy earned him something more valuable than victory, respect from both traditionalists and innovators. Grimm's own apprentices began asking about dragon scale techniques. The Builders Guild, instead of becoming a permanent enemy, became a reluctant partner in spreading the innovation. But the real validation came when King Harald Fairhair himself commissioned Bjorn to roof his new fortress at Avaldsnes. This wasn't just any building project. This was the king's primary stronghold, the symbol of his power. Harald was literally betting his kingdom on Bjorn's innovation. The project attracted builders from across Scandinavia, creating what was probably the first truly international construction crew in Norse history. Danish spies, Swedish craftsmen, Norwegian workers, even roost traders came to observe and learn. Knowledge that had been guarded jealously by individual guilds was suddenly being shared across tribal and national boundaries. But success breeds new enemies, and the Danes weren't content to simply learn from Bjorn's innovation, IRD. They wanted to steal it. A midnight siege of the fortress gave them the perfect cover to attempt to steal the construction plans. They used flaming arrows, expecting to burn the wooden structure and create enough chaos to grab the documents they needed. This is where Astrid's contributions proved crucial. Remember that fire-resistant resin formula she'd taught Bjorn? The dragon-scale roofs, treated with her special mixture, refused to burn. Flaming arrows that should have turned the fortress into an inferno simply bounced off or were extinguished by the roof's design. Water brigades weren't needed. The roofs themselves defeated the flames. The Danish raid failed completely, and the story of the fireproof roofs spread even faster than tales of their waterproofing. Bjorn hadn't just solved the problem of water damage, I have T2. He'd accidentally created the first truly fire-resistant roofing system in Norse history. As dawn broke over the failed siege, Harald Fairhair stood on his undamaged ramparts, looking out over scattered Danish boats fleeing for home. He turned to Bjorn and said something that would be repeated for generations. "You haven't just built me a roof. You've built me a legend." And that legend was about to spread far beyond Norway's borders. Bjorn spent his final 20 years as something unprecedented in the Norse world, a master craftsman whose knowledge was actively sought across entire continents. But this wasn't just about spreading a building technique. This was about fundamentally changing how an entire civilization thought about innovation, adaptation, and survival. Picture this. A man in his 40s, traveling from Iceland's volcanic shores to Greenland's ice fields, from the Rus trading posts along the Volga to the Danish settlements in England. Each location presented unique challenges that would have stumped lesser innovators. But Bjorn's genius wasn't just in his original dragon-scale design, it was in his ability to adapt that core concept to completely different environments and available materials. In Iceland, where volcanic activity was a constant presence, builders began incorporating volcanic ash into the sealant mixture. The ash didn't just add bulk, it created a chemical reaction that made the roofs resistant to the sulfurous gases that could corrode traditional materials. Roofs that might have lasted a decade elsewhere could survive for generations in Iceland's harsh environment. In Greenland, where winter temperatures could kill exposed skin in minutes, they modified Bjorn's formula with whale oil. The oil provided extreme waterproofing that remained flexible even in temperatures that would make normal materials brittle as glass. These adaptations weren't just technical improvements, they were survival innovations that meant the difference between thriving settlements and frozen graveyards. The Rus, those Swedish traders who had penetrated deep into what we now call Russia, faced different problems entirely. Heavy snow loads that could collapse traditional roofs were common, so they modified the angle of Bjorn's scales to shed snow more effectively while maintaining water resistance. Each variation honored the core principle while serving specific local needs. But Bjorn's greatest challenge came with the commission that would define his legacy, the new Temple of Uppsala. The priests demanded something that had never been attempted, a roof designed to last 500 winters. 500. In a world where most buildings were considered ancient if they survived 50 years, this was an almost impossible request. Bjorn, now 60 years old and probably feeling every one of those winters in his bones, assembled a team that would have been unthinkable earlier in his career. His 3 sons and 2 daughters, because women had proven, especially skilled at the precise carving work that the dragon scales required. This wasn't just nepotism. This was recognition that innovation transcends gender boundaries when survival is at stake. The temple project incorporated everything Bjorn had learned over decades of experimentation. Silver threads woven into the sealant created roofs that sparkled in sunlight, while somehow channeling what the builders called positive energy through the structure. Whether you believe in spiritual energy or not, those silver threads served a practical purpose. Nayarte, they conducted electrical charges safely to ground, providing primitive but effective lightning protection. The work took 3 full seasons, and Bjorn pushed himself harder than a man his age should have. But he could sense something his younger colleagues couldn't. Time was running out, and this temple would be his masterpiece, his final statement about what human ingenuity could achieve when properly focused. Death found Bjorn exactly where you'd expect, atop the temple roof during the Great Storm of 915. But this wasn't tragic accident or age-related decline. Witnesses say he climbed up there deliberately, standing, laughing as wind and rain battered him, watching his life's work protect the people below one final time. Lightning struck where he stood, a bolt that should have shattered stone and ignited wood. But the roof's design, incorporating everything he'd learned about both water and electrical management, channeled even heaven's fire safely to earth. They found him at dawn, hammer still in his hand, smiling. The dragon scale technique spread through the interconnected networks that held Norse civilization together. Marriage alliances carried the knowledge between kingdoms. Trade partnerships ensured that successful innovations reached new markets. When Vikings conquered new territories, they brought their superior building techniques with them, improving life for both conquerors and conquered. When Christianity began displacing the old gods, monasteries quickly adopted Bjorn's methods. Monks, with their dedication to preserving knowledge, ensured that the techniques survived religious upheaval. What had begun as a pagan innovation became essential Christian technology, proving that good ideas transcend religious boundaries. Archaeological excavations in modern Trondheim, Hedeby, and Birka have found intact examples of dragon-scale roofing lasting over 600 years. 600 years. These aren't museum pieces carefully preserved under controlled conditions. These are working roofs that continued protecting buildings, long after the civilization that created them had transformed beyond recognition. Modern engineering analysis reveals the true genius of Bjorn's innovation. That specific overlap angle creates micro-vortices that actively repel water while allowing wood to breathe, preventing the rot that destroyed traditional roofing. The tiny carved channels don't just direct water away, they create airflow patterns that dry the wood naturally, making the entire system self-maintaining in ways that even Bjorn probably didn't fully understand. Norwegian architects still study these principles today, adapting 9th-century wisdom for 21st-century sustainable building practices. In an age of climate change and resource scarcity, Bjorn's emphasis on working with natural forces rather than fighting them offers lessons that modern technology desperately needs. But here's what makes this story more than just a historical curiosity. Bjorn's true monument isn't carved in stone or cast in bronze. His monument is functional, living, protective. It's millions of dry homes across centuries, each one sheltering families the way his own family should have been sheltered that terrible night in 875. Every time a roof successfully sheds water in a storm, every time a family stays warm and dry while weather rages outside, every time human ingenuity triumphs over natural forces that once seemed unconquerable, that's Bjorn's legacy. Not fame, not wealth, not even the respect of his peers, but the simple, revolutionary idea that we don't have to accept suffering when human creativity can eliminate it. The young man who watched his sister die in a leaking hall became the master who ensured countless other sisters would live to see spring. In a world where most innovations are forgotten within generations, Bjorn created something that still protects us today. And maybe that's the most Norse ending possible for this story. Not grand speeches or golden monuments, but practical solutions that keep working long after their creator has joined the ancestors. Bjorn's dragon scales still shed water, his principles still guide builders, and somewhere in the modern world, a family is staying dry tonight because a grief-stricken young man refused to accept that water always wins. That's how you defeat the unconquerable. not through force, not through magic, but through the patient application of human intelligence to problems that matter. One shingle at a time, one roof at a time, one life at a time. The water that conquered wood had finally met its match, AI, and its name was innovation.